Morning sunlight in early autumn filtered through the window, casting warm rays onto the sheepskin rug in the living room. Outside, rows of maple trees were turning gold and red, signaling the transition to crisp weather. Chief of Police John Lawson of the small town of Greenwood had just returned from his early jog. He opened the front door rhythmically, immediately catching the gentle aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen. His salt and pepper hair was damp with sweat, but his face glowed with the energy of a new day. John was a disciplined man. Before becoming the chief of police, he had served in military security for over 10 years, then retired due to a knee injury. He returned to his hometown of Greenwood, applied to the local police force, and gradually rose to his current position. Although Greenwood is a small town, its residential areas are quite developed, with rows of houses scattered along winding roads under ancient shade trees. Most residents here are retirees or young families who love the tranquility. John's home is just a 10-minute drive from the police station, a 2-story house in a rural American style with a wide porch, 2 wooden chairs for enjoying the breeze, and a neat lawn out front. Previously, this area was more rural, but in recent years it joined a homeowners association, HOA, known as the Greenwood Gardens Association. John didn't pay much attention to the often strict rules of the association. He simply mowed his lawn on time, painted the house when needed, and completed minor procedures. He preferred to avoid complications. He had just settled into his armchair, turned on the TV for the morning news, and taken a sip of coffee, savoring the mildly bitter warmth. He mentally went over the day's schedule, just a brief meeting with his deputies and a few pending files to wrap up. Suddenly, knock, knock, knock. Urgent banging on the door startled John so much that he nearly spilled his coffee. The pounding was so forceful it rattled the doorframe. Furrowing his brow, John set down his cup and stood up. His professional instincts hinted this might not be a simple drop-by visit. No one ever knocked so aggressively on his door unless it was an emergency. Standing behind the door, John carefully undid the safety lock, peering through a small window in the curtain. On the porch were 3 men wearing navy blue uniforms, but they didn't look like any professional police uniform. The cheap polyester fabric looked flimsy, the stitching was sloppy, and the badge on their chest shimmered like a knockoff. Among the 3, the one in the middle, presumably the leader, was older, sporting a thick mustache and sunglasses. The other 2, younger and taller, seemed slightly uneasy. John had anticipated many scenarios, but he had not expected this sight. Still, as chief of police, he had to handle things calmly. He opened the door, one hand still on the doorframe, eyes steady. "Hello, can I help you?" John asked, striving for a friendly tone. The mustached man in the middle puffed out his chest comically. He flashed a badge that immediately struck John as fake. Its shape, edging, and everything about it screamed counterfeit. Nonetheless, the man declared boldly, "Sir," he began, his voice low as though feigning authority, "we're from the enforcement team of the Greenwood Gardens Association. You've violated regulations, and we need you to step outside immediately." John blinked, suppressing a grin. Enforcement team. He'd never heard of such a title. Normally, the HOA only had a management board and a volunteer neighborhood watch. Never before had they claimed any arrest powers like the police. "My name is John Lawson," he responded, folding his arms. "And I'm sorry, but what authority do you have to arrest me?" The mustached man snapped his fingers, prompting the 2 behind him to raise their chins and nod. "Mr. Lawson," he continued, We received complaints that you're not adhering to important residential regulations. We're here to enforce the rules." John raised an eyebrow, slowly nodding as if evaluating whether it was an April Fool's prank or a trio of delusional men. But it was certainly no April Fool's Day. When local news stations covered the arrests of Mark Ellington, Jonas, and the fake HOA cops, the town of Greenwood buzzed with excitement. Greenwood Gardens felt like it had survived a storm. Most residents were relieved to be free of an oppressive board. One weekend afternoon, John and Carter returned to the neighborhood. The police had set up a support booth to help residents file claims to get their money back. A makeshift stage was erected in the small park for people to line up and fill out official complaint forms. The scene was lively, like a mini-festival, though the subject matter was serious. But spirits were high now that justice was being served. John stepped out of his vehicle and saw Mr. Frank, the older veteran, waiting. The man offered a crisp salute. "Chief Lawson, this is a grand day for Greenwood. Without you, we'd still be cowering." John smiled, shaking Mr. Frank's hand. "We all work together. I just did my job." Maggie, the young mother with her baby, joined them. "Thank you, Chief. I got every penny back from that bogus fine. Now I can fix up my garage without fearing a raid." A group of neighbors held signs reading, "We support Greenwood Police." They cheered as John passed. He'd never been one for big displays, but today he appreciated seeing the joy and relief in their faces. Carter waved from a distance, calling John over to the information table. A county court official was there advising residents on filing for refunds from the HOA. People bustled about, turning in paperwork. Under an arrangement with the prosecutor, all of Mark Ellington's and Jonas's personal assets, plus the HOA funds, would be used to reimburse scammed residents. "The good news," Carter said, "is that most folks will likely get their money back. It'll take time, but at least nobody's out of pocket permanently." John nodded, surveying the park. Children played around a small fountain. Adults chatted excitedly about their neighborhood's future. Though the scandal had scarred Greenwood Gardens, he felt certain it could heal and emerge stronger. Mark Ellington, Jonas, and their accomplices faced trial for fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and unlawful detention. They had threatened to jail residents. The county prosecutor pushed hard, presenting all forms of evidence, from Bethany's video and Jonas's laptop to HOA accounting records and testimony from dozens of victims. Eventually, the court found them guilty. Mark Ellington received a suitable prison sentence. Jonas and the other fake cops were also convicted. Several board members faced lesser or suspended sentences, and all were required to return money illegally obtained. When reporters asked John for his thoughts, he simply smiled. This case proves that anyone who abuses authority, no matter how small or big the stage, will be held accountable. The people of Greenwood deserve a safe, fair community. Following the trial, the old HOA Management Board was dissolved. A new election was held for the Greenwood Gardens Board. Residents voted for more trustworthy figures who promised transparency in finances and fairness to all. Greenwood Gardens found a fresh start. Gone were the days of constant anxiety about wrong porch chairs or unapproved mailboxes. They celebrated with a small gathering at the community park. A lively atmosphere filled the air with refreshments, snacks, and upbeat music. People were laughing and chatting as if they had shed a heavy, invisible burden. John attended along with Deputy Carter and a few colleagues, all smiling and mingling with the neighbors. Bethany, the brave teen, ran over, beaming, "Chief Lawson, I wanted to let you know my video was used as key evidence. The lawyers said I was really brave. John gently patted her shoulder. You did great, Bethany. Without your footage, it would have been harder to pin them down. Mr. Frank joked, Chief Lawson, I once told you to run for mayor. Remember that? Still thinking about it? John laughed. I'm happy as a police chief for now. I'll stick to catching criminals first. Politics isn't my style. The crowd around them joined in good-natured laughter. Someone patted John on the back. Just don't ever leave us, okay? We need a chief like you. John Lawson smiled, taking a cold beer from Carter. The sunset cast an orange glow across the tall maple trees. Kids dashed around the fountain. Neighbors chatted and planned the neighborhood's future. A sense of pride welled within John. He recalled that moment a week earlier when 3 HOA cops tried to arrest him in front of his own house. From that comical beginning came a wave of revelations, exposing a massive scam. Today, justice had triumphed. People realized that when a community stands together, no bully can reign forever. While investigators were finalizing the case, John was informed that Mark Ellington was demanding to see him urgently. Mark claimed he had important information and wanted to negotiate. John entered the interrogation room where Mark sat, looking exhausted but still scheming. Chief Lawson, I know the police and the county prosecutor will go full throttle. I can cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. John studied him. Mark was likely facing serious charges, but his testimony could help expose anyone else involved, or clarify the full scope of the money trail. Talk, John said. What do you have? Mark glanced around as if someone might overhear. I'm not the only one. In the beginning, I was just following suggestions from some core members of the HOA who wanted to raise funds to cover old debts, but it spiraled out of control. Those fake cops were led by Jonas, a friend of mine. We devised a plan to find people to cover deficits. I got caught up, and I was afraid if I didn't play along, they'd turn me in first. I only took a small portion of the money. The rest was shared among them. John narrowed his eyes. So you're shifting blame to Jonas and others? Mark nodded, voice trembling. I have records of their transactions. If you promise me leniency, I'll show everything. John paused in thought. Although Mark was a main culprit to uproot the whole scheme, the department needed the entire network uncovered. John recognized Jonas as the volunteer head of security, a manipulative man with many connections. Fine, I'll forward your offer to cooperate to the prosecutor, but it's up to them if you get a plea deal. You must be honest. Mark bowed his head in acceptance. Over the following days, John and Carter gathered more evidence and set out to find Jonas, the person Mark accused. Jonas had once worked as a private security guard, then quit. The HOA hired him as a volunteer security officer. After hearing about Mark Ellington's arrest, Jonas disappeared. Carter checked traffic cameras and found footage of him driving out of Greenwood the day before. Chief, Jonas is on the run. If we don't catch him soon, he'll destroy the evidence, Carter warned. John frowned. Alert our fugitive apprehension team and coordinate with nearby town PDs to block his escape. He won't get far. Sure enough, 2 days later, Jonas was caught at a seedy motel outside Greenwood. He was packing to flee when the police arrived. In his backpack, they discovered a laptop containing files of their fine and collection logs, more detailed than anything at the HOA office. Brought back to the station, Jonas was defiant at first, but as evidence mounted, he confessed. He also revealed how they procured uniforms and fake badges, and how they timed visits to intimidate residents at vulnerable moments. "I did it for the money," Jonas said bitterly. "And I thought Ellington had my back. Didn't expect him to get nabbed so soon." On the drive back, in the patrol car, John watched Mark through the rearview mirror. Beneath the wiry man's exterior, Mark's eyes darted anxiously. John recalled that a few years earlier, when Greenwood Gardens split from its former association, Mark Ellington had campaigned for the chairmanship, claiming he would improve the quality of life. He promised to give Greenwood a new look, with stricter but better rules. Initially, he was widely supported because of his smooth speaking and skillful organization of community events. But then, the rules tightened, HOA dues spiked, and residents felt they were being closely monitored for every aesthetic detail. Mark boasted, "Greenwood Gardens will be the model community everyone envies," but critics suspected it was all a money grab. Now, the truth had come out. Mark Ellington had pocketed thousands of dollars from these outrageous fines. He'd recruited a group of cronies to pose as HOA police, scaring residents into compliance. Clearly, greed and the lure of power had led Mark down a criminal path. John studied his reflection in the mirror, thinking how sad it was for someone to warp an association's good purpose into a power grab. He resolved to pursue the matter to the end to restore fairness for Greenwood residents. Back at the station, John convened the entire team, assigning tasks. One group took statements from the 3 fake cops. Another group took statements from Mark Ellington and the board members. Another group reviewed the HOA's financial records. John also opened a hotline so that any resident scammed by fines could file complaints. Soon, the phones were ringing non-stop. The station's lobby was packed with angry people explaining how they'd been forced to pay for ridiculous violations. Typically, quiet Greenwood was suddenly abuzz, like it was in the midst of a local scandal. Carter caught up with John in the hallway and handed him a long list. "Chief, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Many paid money but never said a word because they were afraid of losing their home or being threatened. Now they're finally speaking out." John glanced at the list, feeling the weight of responsibility. Then he saw Bethany Caldwell, a 17-year-old neighbor from next door, timidly entering the station with a stack of receipts. She spoke in a shaky voice. "My parents lost a lot of money. The HOA claimed they violated architectural standards. Actually, they just hadn't finished painting the house yet because they both work long hours. The HOA threatened them with court orders. I hate seeing my parents so stressed and still paying that ransom." John gently reassured her. "I understand. My team and I will do everything we can. Hand over any documents you have." Bethany handed him the papers, her hands trembling. Then she added, "I have a secret. I accidentally recorded them threatening my dad on my phone. I hid it in my jacket pocket. Maybe it can help?" John's eyes lit up. "That's fantastic, Bethany. That could be crucial evidence. Can you show me now?" She nodded and pulled up the video on her phone. It clearly showed the same 3 HOA cops outside her house, shouting and threatening to cuff her father over paint colors that were non-compliant. Perfect evidence. John beamed. "Thank you, Bethany. This is a vital piece of the puzzle." It took over an hour for Carter and his teammates to do a preliminary review. They sifted through old files, membership fee receipts, and spending reports. John patiently waited in a small conference room while Carter summarized. "Chief, I found ample evidence of missing money collected from fines that never made it into the official books. It seems the money was being funneled into a personal account. The account holder's name, Mark Ellington." John had suspected as much, but was still taken aback by the blatant nature of the fraud. Breathing deeply, he rose and walked into the main office where Mark and the other board members had gathered. "Mr. Ellington," John said, "I'm afraid we need you to come to the station for questioning regarding this financial shortfall. There's a strong indication of criminal activity." Mark was startled, trying to defend himself. "No, there's a mistake. I only moved the funds through an intermediary account for easier bookkeeping. As for these fines, people violated the regulations. They had to pay." John offered a cold smile. "Yet your tax records make no mention of these thousands of extra dollars. Don't tell me you forgot." Mark Ellington was sweating through his ill-fitting suit, scanning the room as if seeking help from Mrs. Monica, but she looked just as anxious. In a split second, Mark made a dash for the door. Carter reacted swiftly, blocking him. "Where do you think you're going?" Carter demanded, one arm extended. Mark panted. I need to make a phone call. I need my lawyer. I don't trust you." John nodded, stepping aside. "Go ahead. But you're coming with us to the station under investigation." Two other board members began fidgeting nervously. One middle-aged man, Mr. Harrison, stuttered, "I'm just the treasurer. I followed orders from the chairman. I'm not the mastermind." John nodded. "We'll figure out who did what once we investigate. For now, everyone involved needs to cooperate." As predicted, Mark Ellington and two core members were cuffed and led outside. Neighbors around the HOA office saw them, forming a crowd. Most started cheering, relieved to see the oppressive management board finally brought to justice. The Greenwood Gardens Association office was located on Maple Street, next to a small community park. The building appeared well kept from the outside, with a lobby and reception area, often used for neighborhood meetings or community events. When John and Carter arrived, 5 members of the management board were already waiting, looking tense. At the forefront stood Chairman Mark Ellington, a tall, wiry man in his early 50s, clad in a rumpled gray suit that didn't fit well. "Chief Lawson," Mark said with a strained grin, "we heard there was some incident in the neighborhood." John cut straight to the chase. "I've just arrested 3 individuals impersonating the HOA police, calling themselves an enforcement team. They claim the board authorized them to collect fines and detain people. What's your response?" Mark's face tightened. He glanced at the other board members. Mrs. Monica Pierce, an older woman with short silver hair and low-hanging glasses, head of internal oversight, chimed in. "They're just volunteers. They have the authority to patrol and note down violations. But as for arrests, perhaps they misunderstood." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstood." Those 3 wore fake police uniforms, carried cuffs, and collected a wad of cash from residents. You can't pretend the board didn't know. Mark Ellington stood stiff, trying to stay calm. "We knew they were patrolling and issuing citations. But impersonating the police, well, that's beyond their scope. We can reprimand them. There's no need to involve the actual police." John folded his arms. "You must be joking. I am the police chief. They've been arrested for impersonating law enforcement and scamming residents. We'll also launch a full investigation into the HOA's finances. I need you to provide every ledger, financial record, anything relevant." A hush fell over the room. The board members exchanged nervous looks. Finally, Mrs. Monica reluctantly said, "We operate transparently. Of course we'll cooperate. But Chief Lawson, please consider the neighborhood's reputation." John didn't respond. He motioned to Carter, who handed them a search warrant signed by the district judge. Then Carter began checking file cabinets and drawers, collecting documentation. Mark Ellington forced a tight smile. We have nothing to hide. Everything's perfectly legal. Trust me. John smirked. Great. I hope so. At that moment, a young assistant rushed in, flustered, speaking quietly to Mark. Mr. Ellington, I checked the association's treasury records. Some funds are missing. Possibly an accounting error. Mark Ellington snapped angrily. Silence! You're not permitted to do that without my authorization. The assistant shrank back. John narrowed his eyes, exchanging a glance with Carter. Both recognized a strong scent of major misconduct. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. Many of John's neighbors came over, each with stories of being intimidated by these so-called HOA cops. Mr. Frank, an elderly veteran in a faded baseball cap, shared. They fined me $200 last week for excessive lawn decorations. But I only had a small gnome statue and a little solar light along my walkway. They said if I didn't remove them, they'd take me in. A young woman named Maggie, carrying her baby on her hip, vented. I was fined $300 for parking overnight in my own driveway. They claimed some rule against parking outside after 10 p.m. But it's my property. Who gave them that right? Another neighbor, Mrs. Linda, spoke in a trembling voice. They threatened to seize my house if I didn't repaint my fence in the approved color. I just moved in and hadn't had time to repaint yet, so they fined me $500. I didn't dare argue because I was scared. John listened to each story, seeing how unjust it was. He knew that while an HOA can legally oversee landscaping and aesthetics, the act of imposing fines and threats, especially impersonating law enforcement, was a serious offense. He reassured Mrs. Linda. Hold on to any invoices or paperwork they gave you. Also, keep any receipts for payment. The county prosecutor will need to see them. The crowd around them buzzed, some anxious, some relieved that the real police had intervened. Everyone wanted their money back if they'd already paid. John gently patted Mr. Frank on the shoulder, smiling kindly. Don't worry. We'll investigate this thoroughly. It looks like a scam, and we won't let anyone involved slip away. Officer Carter approached John, holding some files he'd retrieved from the fake cops. Chief, take a look at this. The list of residents they fined goes on and on. They threatened property seizures if fines weren't paid. This is definitely a con job. John nodded. I want to know who else is involved and who directed them. If the HOA management board is part of this, we'll be paying them a visit. The other two stood there in shock. One fumbled at his waist, but instead of a gun, which they apparently didn't have, he pulled out a printed citation form, trembling. John jerked his chin. Don't try anything, he said. If you're not real police, that's impersonating a law enforcement officer, a serious crime. Are you aware of the penalty? No sooner had he finished speaking than the familiar woo-woo-woo sound of police sirens approached from a distance. 2 Greenwood police cruisers roared up with flashing red and blue lights. The 3 HOA cops froze like deer in headlights. Officer Simon Carter, a tall, young deputy with a confident stride, stepped out of the first cruiser. Seeing John restraining a uniformed individual, Carter paused momentarily in surprise, then flashed a half-smile. Chief, are you giving a martial arts demo to some volunteers? John released the man, keeping him pinned against the hood, arms behind his back. These 3, John explained, are impersonating HOA police. They tried to arrest me for a wrong mailbox. Carter squinted, moving closer to yank a shiny badge off the mustached man's chest, flipping it in his hand. Greenwood Gardens compliance officer? Looks like a Halloween prop. The mustached man, now somewhat collected, quickly protested. "We're officially authorized by the management board. It's not fake. We have the right to issue fines and detain violators." Carter scoffed. "Authorized? Show me a private security license or any legitimate government credentials." All three stammered. Meanwhile, neighbors were peeking out to watch, buzzing with curiosity. Greenwood rarely saw such a spectacle, let alone right at the police chief's house. John clasped his hands in front, appearing calm. "Last I checked, the HOA here has no authority to form a police force, let alone detain people. Let me guess. You've been collecting money from residents, haven't you?" A look of confusion flickered across the mustached man's eyes. He glared at his two henchmen as if scolding them for slipping up. But John already sensed what was happening. The trio was exploiting the HOA's name to bully and intimidate. They stuttered, We're just doing what we were told. The board directed us to enforce compliance, collect fees, issue fines." Carter signaled to another officer to search the SUV bearing the Greenwood Gardens security logo parked a few steps away. Moments later, the officer emerged with a metal box containing stacks of citation forms, receipts for collected money, and small amounts of cash. Carter whistled. Quite a setup. Plenty of citations, many without official receipts, plus a ledger listing dozens of households and the money fined. John turned back to the mustached man. "How much have you taken from people?" He bit his lip. "We only enforce the rules. The money goes to the management board. We keep a small portion to cover our operating costs." John shook his head. This was exactly the kind of HOA abuse that many residents had complained about. He cleared his throat. "Here's the deal. You have the right to remain silent, and you can have a lawyer. But first, you're coming to the station. You're all under arrest for impersonating law enforcement and fraud." Carter pulled out real handcuffs, locking them around the trio's wrists. Neighbors nearby whispered, and some burst into laughter at the sight of three costumed HOA cops being taken down at the police chief's doorstep. "What rules exactly?" John asked, feigning curiosity. The man pulled out a printed flyer and read it off. "You installed a mailbox that was never approved, and you have outdoor furniture that isn't in the permitted list. That violates Section 4, Clause B, Line 12 of the Greenwood Gardens regulations." John involuntarily glanced past him at the plain black mailbox by the curb, an ordinary model from a home improvement store. The two wooden chairs on the porch also appeared typical. He felt both amused and annoyed. Is this some kind of puppet show police? "I find it intriguing," John arched an eyebrow, "that you want to arrest me just for a mailbox and some wooden porch chairs." The mustached man put on a serious face. "Don't take this lightly. These are clear violations of the rules. Either you come with us to the compliance center, or we'll charge you with non-compliance." John almost burst out laughing at the phrase, compliance center. Ridiculous. Still, he kept his composure. Judging by the smug, stern expression on the mustached man's face, they might have bullied a lot of gullible residents if they were acting this confidently. "I'm sorry," John replied, a hint of sarcasm in his voice, "but I'm not free to go. If you want to arrest me, go ahead and try." The two men behind him visibly tensed. One produced a flimsy metal handcuff, like a child's toy. The other clutched a clipboard. The mustached man glared. "Fine, you asked for it. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." John slowly turned. Instead of complying, he reached down to his belt for his mini walkie-talkie, always by his side, pressing the emergency button. Beep. The entire time, he was eyeing the reflection in a side mirror near the door, monitoring any sudden moves from the trio. The mustached man smirked triumphantly, apparently convinced John was giving in. But just as the accomplice was about to cuff him, John twisted around with lightning speed, wrenched the man's arm back, and slammed him face first against the hood of John's own pickup truck parked in the driveway. The move was so quick and forceful that the man only managed a startled cry.